Hey guys, this is Tyler here. I'm here in Tallinn, Estonia, and I'm going to discuss a kind of controversial topic that I think some guys aren't going to like here, but I think it's necessary. And that is how PUA, pickup artists, had a lot of negative effect on dating and relationships worldwide. Okay, so anyone that doesn't know this PUA, pickup artist, basically these guys seek out women using different techniques, whether it's on the street, it's in any public location basically, and they physically present themselves to the women and essentially try to attract them enough to most often get a few dates in, and try maybe get them in the bedroom, so to speak. So that's kind of the main concept of a PUA. Some of them do those also seek out long-term relationships from these techniques or even marriage, but more often than not, they aren't seeking these long-term relationships or marriages. Some are, but that's generally the exception. The PUAs, I think, started becoming something bigger in the early 2000s. It was a very new concept to many people until quite recently. Many guys here have probably heard of Rush V. There was Strauss and Tucker. I can't remember his last name, but all of these guys, these were like the early PUAs, and they were very, very well known. The very first PUAs, because they had so much control over the industry, this was before a lot of the internet era. These guys published like DVDs and self-help videos. Essentially, a lot of these guys were ordering their products through the mail. Some of these guys actually accumulated like 10-figure net worths. They became very wealthy and then basically retired. Rush V was probably the last major guy that most people would recognize. He got started like in the early to mid 2000s and basically went until just a few years ago, and some people may be aware of his whole transformation now. But these guys had a lot of impact on many guys out there, for both good and bad. If we go back to the 1990s, PUA wasn't a very well-known concept. It was very new to most people, and they were not familiar with what this was. It was something that many guys hadn't really engaged or done, because before this point, most guys didn't apply these techniques. Now and then there were isolated cases, guys that were ahead of their time and wouldn't apply these techniques, but that was pretty uncommon. It was not very normal, but there were guys, of course, that did it, but not too many. These guys, so were able to, of course, sell a lot, as I stated before, and kind of introduced a huge demographic of men to these techniques all over the world. I think first mostly in North America, and then in Western Europe, and then in Australia, and then everywhere else. And these guys became very well known. Earlier on, the guys were a little more liked by mainstream, but as time went on, I think they actually became less liked by mainstream. And we saw this when Rush V was pretty prominent. He was getting a lot of flack from the media. The PUAs, of course, were more associated with both like relationships and for men to just simply get on dates, to get in the bedroom, as I said. It wasn't really associated with politics and with any of these gender constructs. As time went on, like most areas, it did start becoming more political. These men started becoming more associated with the manosphere, the red pill, some other libertarian groups that, of course, mainstream doesn't like. And that's where it started turning the tide for these guys. We saw guys also like Street Attraction. People here may be familiar with like Richard and his crew from there, and they actually were, their whole brand, of course, was basically eliminated from YouTube. And so all of these people, though, have had a lot of impact on game and what it is. The game is what PUA, pickup artists, taught. That's what they identified. That's the term they used, was game. Game was how to attract and get a woman to go out with you, to go on dates, and potentially to get into the bedroom. That's what the game was. Some guys could do it within hours. They could attract the girl enough that the girl would eventually be in their bedroom within like the same day. This was a technique that worked fairly well, honestly, in many countries up until probably about 5 to 10 years ago. And then it started changing because, like anything, it became very mainstream, and so many guys were using it that it didn't work. Mostly younger women had figured this out, that this whole game, and it became more and more difficult to convince them that it was authentic and you were genuine and sincere in your intentions. And it also meant that more females were overly saturated with male attention, and this is what one of the main problems was. If we look back even like in the 1990s, when game was not too big, we also didn't have internet, online dating wasn't big, there wasn't nearly the amount of saturation like there is now. And now, obviously, I think it slowly became online dating, started replacing more the game from the PUA, and both in some places. It's actually both PUAs and also game. More recently, I think it's more internet focused. But these guys, they of course apply their game techniques and they're desiring this outcome. Now, unfortunately, as this became more common, more girls started to experience it used on them, and they also saw it published more often in media. They could see it on YouTube, they could read about it, and start realizing that game was being used on them. If we go back to, like, say the early 2000s, I remember some of like Rush V's early articles. In this era, many girls, like in college, they didn't know what game was. They had no clue. I mean, this was like the blog era of game. No one knew hardly anyone knew what game was at this point in time. But you fast forward like 5 years later, and 10 years later for sure, it was very mainstream. And every other person knew what game was, unless you were dealing with a girl that was like right out of high school or like in their late teens. It was going to be very difficult for it to work because they could hardly see through it. And as I stated before, it was simply oversaturation of attention on the female population. Honestly, many of these guys didn't bring to the table, honestly, what it would have taken for long-term relationships. And this is also what more guys started realizing. That game was basically just like kind of like an act that a guy put on. It elevated their sense of value to the woman for a small amount of time, but then that perceived value just went down. The woman didn't see them as a high value person because it was more of a show, rather than for the guy just to kind of live out this lifestyle day in and day out. They were kind of putting on this show, and it wasn't sustainable. It wasn't long term. And I had even read about guys that got into marriages using a lot of game, and those marriages ended within like a couple years, and some even had a child or two, and then they would be in a divorce because it was just one big show leading up to this. And this is actually one of the things that caused game to lose popularity, because guys started realizing, well, my whole life has to embody what I'm showcasing, so it's really more about me than about game. The game doesn't really work. We also saw, like in public venues like bars and entertainment places, nightclubs, it wasn't working. Within, say, 10 years' time, it just was losing its effectiveness. Even though a guy could have the best game in the world, it was not enough. It was overly used. The woman probably had already been approached and had that used like 200 times before, so it lost its authenticness, and of course then it wasn't very effective. And then I think that's where guys started understanding that game was more of a tool to seek out women that already had pre-interest, because I know Sandman had discussed this in a previous video, that the main point of game was for guys, of course, just start realizing it was inutile, or that the application of game wasn't working. At the same time, though, it caused a lot of problems. I mean, it was due to this era. This was pre-online dating, and then online dating started coming into play. This was the first time, basically, in history that women had received this much attention. They had never received this attention before. And it also, unfortunately, was meant that a lot of guys who were very dishonest, they were very deceptive. They were guys that acted like they were wealthy and they weren't, or they had status and they weren't. They were guys that maybe claimed that they were interested in relationships and they weren't. Some bad characters, of course, just simply bad people that were attracting these younger women. And all of these factors just created a bad situation for all men, because these guys were so desperate and thirsty. Not all of them. I mean, some of them were seeking genuine relationships. That it created a big mess for genuine guys like us in MGTOW. This was unfortunately what a lot of the PUA era produced. And truthfully speaking, if you ask most guys now, I mean, how many that are actually in relationships now, how many of you guys used PUA tactics, techniques to find your girlfriend or find a wife that you've been with for at least 3 or 5 years? I can almost assure you that most of them would say zero. Most of these guys, it's probably a small percentage that were actually able to use these techniques to find a genuine girlfriend or wife long term. And that's this sad reality here, that a lot of these techniques didn't really account for like any real long-term relationships, because most guys, of course, typically end up meeting the person they're with long-term through like mutual friends, maybe work setting, some kind of personal setting, some kind of face-to-face acquaintance situation, maybe online dating also nowadays. But typically the PUA scenario doesn't really play out for long-term relationships, and that's just what it is. And one of the other reasons why is because this was a very well-adopted tactic for guys that were living abroad in foreign countries. I think international PUA, if we go back 5 or 10 years ago, especially 10 to 8 years ago, it was so big. I mean, this was probably one of the biggest search terms of dating on Google. International PUA also hurt a lot of countries. When we look at places, whether it's Estonia, like the Baltic countries, Poland, some of the other Eastern European countries, some of Latin America, it was really a shame, honestly, what it did. I actually live in one of the countries, Estonia, that probably got hit one of the hardest. And it's disgusting, honestly, what it turned places like this into, because it made it very difficult for foreign guys that came afterward that were seeking genuine relationships. This is why, I mean, if we look at the whole concept of PUA, at its root, it works at certain points. I mean, for guys who don't have good game with meeting a woman that wants to seek out a relationship, it helps. I won't lie. In terms of my first successful dating experiences, I looked into techniques and ways to apply some of the PUA tactics, and it helped me, honestly. Absolutely. It did set some of the basic foundations that I needed. But at a certain point, I actually stopped following a lot of this, because it helped get a guy kind of going started. Once you get to a certain point, PUA doesn't really work. You're right. There's other things here that a guy's going to have to understand and actually apply day in and day out. Of course, at its root, PUA is kind of it's like a psychology game, honestly. That's really what it is. It's a game of psychology, mastery of behavior cues, and of being able to sense out the right kind of person or people to approach in potential success. And that's where I think it could actually be more effectively applied to like business, to sales, actually selling a product or service, rather than just trying to sell yourself to another party like a girl. There's definitely more long-term viable ways to apply these same kind of behavioral techniques, and that's where it really boils down to. Is this was a way to apply behavioral psychology into short-term dating experiences. That's why I always think it's much more effective for a guy to learn and study behavioral psychology, because this, I think, can be more universally applied to things of like consumption behaviors and sales. As I said before, it goes deeper into the root causes of what drive desires, because that's really what it's about. It's about being able to engage and understand how to manipulate desires. That's, I guess, how you could explain it. The PUAs also inflated, as I alluded to before, the sense of self-worth of these women, mostly younger women. And it created this system where girls who were, we'd say, 6s thought they were 8s, 8s thought they were 10s, 4s thought they were 6s, because previously most women weren't being approached or sought out this much. They were being sought out maybe like in school and work and mutual associations, but now they were being sought out everywhere. And so girls that were not just attractive physically, but also like internally, like that just had good characteristics. These girls were being sought out like 10 times more than they had previously. And this was a huge problem. And this is also where I had mentioned about the international PUA. Same problem here, and maybe worse, because in these foreign countries, and also for domestic guys, it made it worse for domestic guys. I can say for certain here in the Baltics that it also did make it worse for Estonian guys. The thing is that these international PUAs were going for girls also that were very low when it came to quality, 4, 6, 8, and immediately all of them, their value of course was going up quite a bit, tremendously, and it hurt both foreign guys who were coming there, and then it also hurt domestic guys who were already living there, because they were being hit up by guys that were claiming to be some kind of successful entrepreneur. They were guys that supposedly had big homes, that had fancy cars, that were traveling all over the world, doing whatever. Some of these guys were like staying in hostels. They were globetrotters that were actually quite broke, and they were just simply lying to try to get into the bed of one of these ladies they met, and it just kind of screwed with the whole environment. It's unfortunate now. It is interesting though, because the real young generation, like Generation Z girls, if you talk to them, like girls that are late teens, maybe to 21, 22, some of them actually have not had as much PUA applied on them as like girls now that are between 25 to 30. It's really interesting actually, if you talk to some of these girls, because they're in Generation Z now, and I think online dating kind of replaced this area, and just the fact that there hasn't been, I think, as much international PUA, it's kind of lost some of its popularity in the past few years due to economic factors, online dating, and just desire for guys to do this. It's just not as popular. Guys like Roosh kind of made it more of a trend, and then when Roosh got out of it, I think a lot of guys kind of followed likewise and just realized how much of a waste of time it was. I'm not saying it was always a waste of time, or it is. In certain cases, like to learn, for an inexperienced guy to learn initial game who doesn't have a good fatherly figure, and just basic attraction cues, some behavioral psychology it's very effective with. But when you go beyond a certain point, you have to kind of toss this out the window. You have to embody certain characteristics in your overall lifestyle, if that makes sense. I think also in like America, Canada, Anglosphere, Britain, this Me Too movement 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer, this created a really bad situation in regards to pickup and the overall perception of it, because this wasn't in the picture like 15 years before, and this was another, I think, big hit to the PUA community, the manosphere community, because guys could start being charged with harassment at work, at school, in public. There was a lot of disgust from women in their home countries about this, and this also, I think, did make some guys resort more to the international PUA, because this homegrown movement was becoming more phased out, because guys were just simply, I think, too afraid. They were too concerned about getting into trouble with the law, about having harassment charges pressed against them, and potentially affecting career opportunities, overall well-being, other issues. They just stuck away from this and avoided it. And I think that was actually one of the biggest early things that triggered PUA to decline like 5 or 6 years ago. And since then, it's been on the decline, especially in the past year or two. It's really been declining, and I think it will just continue to decline. This is actually a big win for MGTOW. I mean, MGTOW is the new PUA. I tell that to people. MGTOW, I mean, some of you guys out there, I mean, have relationships, maybe short-term relationships or even long-term relationships. It's not to say that you can't utilize some of these techniques and concepts, but overall, I think MGTOW is just a better philosophy if you want to have long-term happiness. I certainly started learning about PUA maybe 19 or 20 years old, and it was very interesting. It certainly got me going earlier on. It helped me get my first relationships. There's just something that PUA is not going to help you with in terms of long-term relationships and just your overall mental well-being, and that's where MGTOW, I think, is the ideal philosophy here. So give me your take on this video, and thank you.